Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures, a show where my guests and I get to explore entrepreneurial stories, market landscapes, problem spaces, and examine together how new ventures might be able to be created, either for-profit, nonprofit, or personal ventures to benefit humanity. Really, the purpose of this show is to educate and inspire a new generation of venture builders and venture investors to make the world a better place. In today's episode, my guest is Joel Fariss, and he and I have known each other for over a decade now. And my conversations with him over the years around design, around the future of work, around really the future of humanity have been endlessly fascinating. So in today's episode, we have a chance to dive into multiple facets of the word and practice of design. And we talk about not only sort of on a tactical level, how the work landscape has changed here in 2020 in light of the pandemic, but what this might mean for our future as a species in terms of our ability to understand bias and create equitable work environments, and the interface with technology and the shifting of work and the purpose of work as it relates to design is a lot of what we talk about today. So, if you are watching this episode, you can listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. And if you're listening, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com. And there you'll see more extensive show notes to the topics and authors and books and things that we talk about today. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Joel Fariss. All right, Joel, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am excited to talk with you about a variety of topics. You and I have known each other for over a decade now. It is always a pleasure to talk with you about the future and philosophy and epistemology and the intersections with knowledge and innovation, design, and frankly, just creating better experiences for humans. And so why don't we start by, for those who don't know you, would you just tell us a little bit about your background and things you do professionally and are thinking about these days?
Yeah, sure. So my path has been really serendipitous. I never really intended to end up where I'm at today. I started in undergrad as a theology major, studying history and religion and philosophy and things of that sort, and went off into the world as in the NGO space and doing economic development work in East Africa, and met some people along the way and discovered some interesting work that was happening in the world of design. And I'd always thought about design as kind of an outcome, right? Like a user interface, that's design, or a building, right? Architecture, that's design. I never had thought about design as a process, or even more than that, a mental model, a way of perceiving the world. And so I was invited into this world of design and started discovering that there was a lot of fascinating and interesting things happening, and was mentored by some really amazing people, and basically learned on the job over the last decade, qualitative research and insight and foresight type work, continued to study, and just had some opportunities that I took, and said yes to things that maybe I didn't have any business saying yes to, but figured it out along the way. And that led me to a really amazing opportunity starting in 2014 to go work as an innovation advisor to the mayor of Seattle. Did that for a couple of years. And then for the last 3.5 years, I've had the pleasure of working for a design firm called Gensler, where I lead applied research in strategic futures. So we work with clients around the world globally to deconstruct stagnating complexity and help them to understand the forces that are shaping their organization, their business, their market space, their customers, and where the opportunities are to continue to evolve and adapt. So that's what we do now. And it's been a wild ride getting here, and folks like yourself have been really pivotal for me in being a mentor and facilitating these conversations. I always love our conversations, and so that's where I'm at today. And thinking a lot about work, obviously, with COVID and the way that work has been disrupted in unprecedented ways. Thinking a lot about kind of the economic structures and systems of our society as we kind of continue moving into this, not just a new century, but a new millennium, and thinking about what's this next millennium of the social agreement going to look like systemically. Thinking a lot about the future of human experience and how technologies and XR technologies are going to continue creating, more white space and bigger sandboxes to explore and play in regarding experience. And I think BCI is a big one that I think we're going to see in the next decade, along with things like 5G and 6G. We're really going to see, I think, a Cambrian explosion of new experiences and new ways of conceptualizing what it means to be human. So it's a really exciting time. A lot of cool stuff.
I like how you teed up design. I think many people, when especially if you're, hey, I need a designer. You're right. They're thinking about outcome. They're thinking about the way that something looks. How do you think about design? I know we hear a lot about sort of design thinking, human-centered design, and maybe some people have been exposed to different design paradigms or frameworks out there. But how do you, maybe step one from an education standpoint, for those listening in who haven't thought about design very carefully, maybe step one is sort of help us define it in terms of how you think about it. And then maybe step two, tell us about how you go about the world of design in your day-to-day life.
Yeah. So I think, design has a rich history, right? I mean, if you think about the invention of the wheel, you could say that was design, right? If you think about, Babylonian master planning and urban development, that's all design, right? So design, from my perspective, is fundamental to what it means to be human. It's actually an innate characteristic and quality of human experience. When we, engage with the world around us and make intentional decisions about how that engagement looks or what it feels like, to my mind, that's all design, right? So I often in lectures and in teaching environments, I ask, did anyone here have someone else pick out their outfit for them this morning, right? And of course, no one raises their hand. And so the idea is that, okay, you designed your appearance, right? You took an intentional approach to determining how you were going to show up and express yourself through garments. So that's design, right? If you've ever had to determine how you get from destination A to destination B, point A to point B, right? You're designing a journey of sorts. If you've had to facilitate a meeting, right, you're designing an experience, right? By putting together an agenda and talking points and facilitating conversation, you're designing an experience. So I think design is much broader than an outcome or something visual or an artifact of a process. And that hasn't always been the case. I think that, there's a famous designer named Victor Papanek who in the 60s and 70s really started to perpetuate this idea of design as more than just a process or an outcome. And then you have people like, Jessica Helfand, who's she founded the really, really popular online design blog called Design Observer. She was a dean of design at Yale grad school of design. And she says, design is just to make things known, right? So she's taking much more of an epistemological approach to understanding the world around us through the lens of design. So this idea that design is a way of engaging with the world is pretty new, philosophically speaking. But what that means for me in the everyday is that we're all designers, right? Anyone who is shaping any sort of element or domain of human experience is a designer. And design is not necessarily like design thinking, right? Something that we often think about. I do believe that there is also design feeling and design believing and design doing, right? There's all sorts of kinds of designs that incorporate and the full embodiment of human experience. So on a day-to-day basis, I'm not a designer, but I'm a designer in the sense that I'm not a designer in the traditional sense that I'm like sitting and, pushing pixels around and creating really beautiful things. I wish I could do that. I'm a designer in the sense that I'm thinking about uh, broad intersectional systems, right? And how those things interact with each other. I'm a designer in the sense that I'm thinking about, for example, I have a client right now who's thinking about, hey, let's completely upend and reinvent the notion of what it means to be an employee for a large enterprise. Um, I think the question that many enterprises today are being forced to ask is, who am I responsible for, right? And then to what extent? And what we're working with right now with this particular client is, you are responsible for your employees, but you're also responsible for their families. And the to what extent question, the answer has become, you're not just responsible for equipping them to meet the demands of their job, but you're responsible for equipping them to meet the demands of life. And so that's a design problem, right? We're trying to understand what are the various experiences and interactions and systems that facilitate and power all of this day to day that have to be intentionally put in place, right? As a platform for life where we can really elevate quality of life, connection, depth of joy, gratitude, right? All of these things that are really important to actualization, transcendence, etc. Purpose, meaning, fulfillment. Um, taking an intentional approach to understanding that system, and then standing up technologies and processes and policies and cultivating a culture that are all working in tandem towards that outcome. That's design. So I think anyone who is trying to, again, make an intentional decision around how people live is doing design work. And that's the way we practice design at Gensler, on my team specifically.
So a lot of questions there, but I'm actually curious to just maybe go a little bit of a personal route here. So uh, I have been writing code more recently, quite a lot on nights and weekends. One, because I just enjoy it.
Mhm.
Two, I have these ideas that I want to bring to life in the
Right.
world.
Yeah.
And I found that as I'm writing code, kind of late into the night or sort of early mornings, I find myself wondering, who am I writing this for?
Right.
And how am I even thinking about this? And there's always some critic in the back of my brain that's telling me, "Oh, you're not good at design." And
Mm-hmm.
but then there's another sort of the red devil and the angel on my shoulder saying, "Well,
Right.
what do you mean by design?"
Right.
So
Exactly.
I'm curious, for me personally, as I'm sitting down and writing code, in my brain I'm thinking, okay, I'm not only designing this for the experience of the people who are going to be swiping and clicking on their computers,
Yep.
but I'm also designing it for the other engineers and front end developers who are going to be in this code with me. So in one sense, I'm communicating with my future collaborators
Mm-hmm.
on this code base.
Mm-hmm.
And then in another sense, I'm designing it architecturally so
Sure.
that it
Right.
can scale,
Yep.
so that it's secure. I don't have training. I've always just sort of thought I'm not very good at design. But for people like me listening in, there's maybe a lot of technical co-founders that are just sitting down in front of their computer and coding away. How should we be thinking about design, and how can we improve even the way that we go about creating in the world today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love that. And I think it's a really great example. I would absolutely say that you're a designer, right? When you're doing all of that, just like you just stated. Um, I don't know. See, this is where the boundaries between art and creativity and design and science and engineering, all for me are very blurry.
Mm.
And I think that in a lot of cases, standing up these parameters and calling certain things design or certain things art and calling other things not are a bit arbitrary and not helpful in the long run.
Mm.
Um, because it depends on your goal, I think, in a lot of cases, right? Like, um, I can do pure generative speculative art with the intent of uh, plugging into an economic system in which that art is going to give me a significant return, right? Financially speaking. So there's an economic factor, right? I can also do science and engineering with zero uh, preconceived notion of an outcome in terms of financial return. And often we think of it in the opposite, right? We think of art as something that you just do that's not necessarily economical, right? And we think about science and engineering as something that we do for the sake of business and economic return. And I think that if you flip the economic paradigm, then what does that mean for the activity, right? So I think those are the kinds of questions. I don't have the answer to that question, but I do think those kinds of questions implicate these arbitrary parameters that we place on these kinds of activities. So I would say we don't need necessarily more designers or better designers. We don't necessarily need software engineers to be better designers, and we don't need designers to be better software engineers. What we need holistically is better human beings, right? And so I think it's like I tend to think in post-disciplinary terms. It's not what your job title is. It's more of a humanistic lens of how are you contributing to your species, right? That's what we need. So when you're writing code or you're developing a button for a UI, or you're thinking about, an enterprise system that empowers employees to perform more effectively, it doesn't matter your medium, it doesn't matter your process. What I would be most concerned with is how are you contributing to your species? Are you elevating the game? Are you in any way contributing to the broader pool of ideas and that collective commons of thinking that's going to, liberate or untether someone from some preconceived constraint that they have, right? Where they are able to then better access their latent potential and better able to amplify their strengths and continue, like, again, just snowball that common contribution. So I think design or disciplines in general can be a misnomer, and so I would say that. I'd also say it doesn't matter if you're a designer or an engineer or whatever. It's, are you open to new ideas, right? Are you willing to learn? So follow your curiosity. Go wherever it leads you. Be willing to think about things that are hard to articulate. There's so many ideas, they start as pre-verbal, but because we're so language oriented as an empiricist society, we don't spend the time allowing those things to percolate and incubate. So we never tease them out. And so what we end up doing is we end up only pursuing and applying the things that we're able to articulate, put language to. Language as kind of a proxy to evidence, right? That there's something viable about this idea because I can articulate it. And this is what I mean by design feeling or design believing, right? That reality has disclosed itself to me in some way. I've seen, we call this a hunch, right? But I don't know quite yet how to describe it. I know it's that direction and I want to pursue it and I want to go after it, but I can't quite fully articulate it, right? And so people go like, oh, either I can see it too, let's go, or I don't really know. So we don't resource those people to go pursue those things, right? And so massive ideas get missed because I can't prove that there's an actual idea there, so I'm not going to go after it. Anyways, to summarize all of that, disciplinary boundaries can be arbitrary. Don't think about it like that. Think about it more as in terms of how am I contributing to my species and what does it mean to be a good human? And then 2, how am I creating space as an engineer, as a fill in the blank, to follow my hunches? And if you can do that, I think that will raise the bar significantly in your practice and in your discipline, no matter what you're doing.
I like that. What I'm hearing is, as I'm in the late nights and early mornings writing code, curious about why I'm doing what I'm doing, who my audience is. I think the heuristic of remembering how am I contributing to humanity
Mm-hmm.
is I think the right frame. And so yes, I think it's good for me to empathize with future engineers and DevOps people that are going to try to scale this thing if and when it takes off, and obviously the end user of the software. But I
Right.
think the idea around why are we doing, how are we making, not only just making the world a better place, but actually, like you said, how are you contributing to our species, is a whole nother level of thinking, because it's very too easy to get myopic
Yeah.
around our different pursuits.
Right.
Even last night, my wife and I were talking about, at Proto, we have, for those who are watching or listening who are unfamiliar, we have this true north in my operator investor group around human flourishing. We basically want our vision for everything that we work on to be human flourishing. And now the mission can look very different. And so we were kind of exploring last night about what if we took the heuristic around the mission of this particular application or this particular service is, can this be the best possible place on the internet for X, or the best possible service for X?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can't either pivot our definition of what X is to find something that we can make a positive contribution to society in, or if we literally just don't have the ability to build it, then we say no. Then we either pivot or don't work on that and put our efforts elsewhere. Like I remember as a grad student thinking about why am I spending so much of my time studying protein interactions with this extracellular matrix protein? Like how am I contributing to society by doing this? And I remember being almost a slave to this. How is this practical? Like, how is this going to cure a disease or enable some kind of technology that's going to help the world? And I think later in life, I've sort of thought about, well, just the practice of doing it is, one, just important for humans, just to create. Like for me as a human, to go through the process of designing experiments, running experiments, seeing what happens, and then hopefully writing about it to help out future people. That in and of itself is interesting. But also, if you do take the practical lens, there is you never know what you're going to uncover. You never know what you're going to discover. So I think your reference earlier to a Cambrian explosion of things that are coming, and a couple episodes ago we were talking about Web3 technologies, about how there's lots of experiments being run right now. You don't really know who's going to discover something interesting. But like all innovation and technology, we're sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, right? We're building iteratively on things that collectively we as humans are discovering.
Yep.
And I think that's, for those of us that maybe get a little angsty around purpose and why we're doing what we're doing, maybe that perspective can potentially be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that's a really critical, that idea of standing on the shoulders of giants. Stephen Johnson wrote a book called Where Good Ideas Come From, and he talks about this principle in evolutionary biology called the adjacent possible. And the adjacent possible is the idea that, every big kind of invention, right? So think about, electric cars, right? Well, what had to exist pre-electric car for an electric car to be a feasible thing? So we had to have battery technology. Well, what had to exist for battery technology to be a thing, right? If you follow, like there's this lineage and this ancestry and this heredity that you can follow back all the way, sometimes in some cases centuries. And so every step of the way, that scientist or that researcher, that inventor back in, could be 1700s, he's opening this door that he's not ever going to be able to walk through, but the next generation is, right? That's the adjacent possible, that he opens the door, they walk through, and they get into a bigger room. It's bigger, brighter, it's more well lit. They then continue to do their work, and they stand up these studies, and they learn and they research and they invent new things, and that then in turn opens more doors. The next generation gets to walk through. And so, Elon Musk could never do what he's doing. Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, like name a big successful tech billionaire today, right? What they've accomplished wouldn't be possible were it for not the adjacent possible going back centuries in some cases. So that even your protein studies, right? what you're doing is you're opening the door to an adjacent possible that would not have existed for the next generation had you had not kind of done that work and established that foundation.
Mm.
So I think even the monotonous, tedious work of, developing new code and running these tests and trying to learn, and it's like iterative over and over and over again, you're doing the hard work of opening up new doors that otherwise wouldn't be opened. And that's a critical precondition for innovation. So
So pandemic hits this year. Everybody, no lack of conversation about people discovering that a alternative form of working can actually work for a bunch of people.
right.
So obviously, it's interesting that a bunch of workforce working from home and kind of what productivity has looked like, et cetera, et cetera. But that's just a very small sliver, I think, of the more meta conversation going on around the future of the future of work and what it means for us as humans, what it means for us as creators,
Yeah.
what it means for us as designers. And you mentioned earlier how you're, between XR and sort of where technology is heading. I'm curious, how are you approaching this conversation in light of what 2020 here has sort of thrust upon us?
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much. I think one of the things that I've been really interested in lately is the history of the critique of work. I mean, the critique of work goes back to Plato. Like, it's not a new thing, right? The idea that, for example, there was an era in the Roman Empire where work was the thing of the lower class, right? And so work was almost something to be shunned. Like, if you had to go work, that socially said something about your status, right? And that idea was revived in kind of Enlightenment era, pre-Enlightenment era in Western Europe, where you had this aristocracy that really, again, thought of work as kind of this thing's like, no, that's not, we're above that, right? And so work was very much tied to notions of social status, and it's been that way for thousands of years. And then you saw the labor movements, right, of the kind of 19th century, 20th century, and even 18th century, where factories started to blow up. And before that, work had been something that we often did in our homes. So working from home was kind of the norm pre-industrial revolution to some degree. And industrial revolution brought with it the labor movement, right? And so labor rights and all of that kind of stuff. And so there's this really rich tradition through the industrial revolution and into the early 20th century, when you saw F.W. Taylor kind of as the father of modern management, kind of not necessarily invent, but really socialize and scale, heuristics of optimization and efficiency. So that worked really well for the industrial age, and we were able to create, again, like unprecedented value and wealth and quality of life around the world via the industrial economy. But again, as work evolved and the context of modern work continued to evolve, so did the critique of work. So that led to thinkers like Andre Gortz in the 1970s and 80s, critiquing work and labor, and tapping into the thinking of a lot of science fiction writers of the 50s about these kind of utopian worlds, right? You even have kind of this Keynesian, 1940s Keynesian utopian economy in which, in 2020, we're only going to be working, according to Keyes, like 4 to 5 hours a week or something like that, right? So this idea has been around for a long time. It's not a new idea. And then you've got more recent thinkers like Peter Frayne and others. What's his name? The anthropologist, the founder of the We Are the 99%. I'm blanking on his name. David something. I have to go find his book. He wrote a whole book. He wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs, which he took an anthropological approach to understanding what the workforce and the labor market looks like today. You've got researchers at Microsoft like Sid Zahari, uh, writing books like, and Mary Gray, his writing partner, Mary Gray, wrote a book called Ghost Work, right? Getting to understanding how automation is implicating the technological labor market. So think like Mechanical Turk and things like that, right? And the people who are these, basically they're the brokers between these AI cycles. And so you have these automated systems that still need a human broker at some link in this network. And what that looks like, call centers and things like that. You've got, what's his name? It's Peter Pfeffer at Stanford, wrote a book called, Dying for a Paycheck, where he's taken an assessment of the health implications of modern work, and how, the stress of modern work is affecting our global health. And his conclusion after a meta-analysis of the literature was that work is the 5th leading cause of death in the United States. Then you've got people like Alex Sanjung Pung, I believe, Korean American entrepreneur, investor, author, consultant in the Silicon Valley area, wrote a book called Rest. So there's a bunch happening. The founders of Boot Camp, right? Those guys have talked a lot about work in the last 15 years. So there's a lot of commentary in the world today around work, and it's all grounded in a rich tradition of the critique of work and the envisioning of a life of leisure and what might work look like in the future. All of that to say, I think that what we're seeing today happen is a broad willingness, where this conversation that's been in the philosophical fringe for a long time is now being drawn into the center of the dialogue at a social level, where you have corporations like Microsoft piloting 4-day work weeks, right, in Japan. I believe that news article, when it was released, was probably received more brand hits than any of their other kind of PR, right? You've got the Prime Minister of New Zealand touting the idea of a 4-day work week. You've got countries like the Netherlands thinking about policy around the 4-day work weeks. You've got entire school districts in Colorado are going to a 4-day learning week, because a lot of the psychology and the literature and the research of the last 40 years has shown that as we move more and more towards a knowledge worker or even a learning worker model of work, that productivity really peaks and plateaus at 25 hours a week. To try and be productive past 25 hours is almost impossible. In some cases, 30 hours. But the studies have shown that, working 55 plus hours is not more productive than the person working 25 hours. So productivity science in and of itself is actually affirming and confirming a lot of the social critique of the last century around work, and what that means for how we spend our time and how we create value, how we measure and index value, who we create value for, and what is the role and purpose of work in general in our lives, right? So I think that conversation is really interesting. And you have companies today, the majority of our clients are Fortune 100 clients. They're actually willing to have this conversation. They're actually willing to ask themselves, what is the role of work for our employees in their lives? What is the role of work for our employees in broader society? And could our construct of work today have anything to do with, the climate crisis? The answer is yes. Could our construct of work today have anything to do with, the social and economic disparity and inequity that we're facing and that we're continuing to tease out? Could our construct of work have anything to do with these notions of systemic racism and bias? Could our construct of work have anything to do with perpetuating, poverty and these other economic disparities, right? So I think that work is really at the center of a lot of these dialogues. And so I think what's really, really exciting is that we can start thinking about work, not as much as like, what time should you be here, and can you work from home, and should you have a sit-stand desk, and how often should you get a new computer, and what does virtual collaboration look like, and will people come back to an office, and how do we, that's all fine. Those are good conversations to have, and those are very tactical things to solve for. But the opportunity right now is to go far beyond that. The opportunity to say, okay, yeah, we know people can work from home. We know sit-down desks are great. We know collaboration is important. We know socialization is key for learning and knowledge exchange. Yes. And what could people be doing? How could we possibly advance our society and our species if we worked less? Because everything we see in the literature is showing us that if we are freed up, and we have more free time today than we've ever had in human civilization, if we continue to advance that trajectory towards more leisure, towards more community engagement, towards more play, towards more non-objective discovery and research work, could we actually unleash a wave of innovation like we've never seen? Because we're allowing people to engage with a relaxed attention where they're not having to focus on the production of something, but instead can be productively inefficient, where they're not trying to optimize an activity, but they're trying to create the space for connections and dots, colliding, and ideas evolving, and hunches being followed. And right, this is why the mythology of Google's 20% time is so prevalent. I think because it resonates with something innate in us that we know, yeah, I want that too. Like I want that time to just go explore stuff that has like zero constraints on feasibility and viability. And so I think beginning to reformulate the role of work in our society is the opportunity that we're being presented with today in light of COVID. It's not a new model of work from home or third places or the office. Like that's old news. People have been doing that for decades, right? What's exciting is, could we fundamentally reimagine work altogether, and rethink about what the role of work is for individuals, for our families, for our communities, and for our society as a whole.
So what's your take? Obviously, you've done a fair amount of thinking and reading and studying on the topic, which is fascinating. I have a huge ton of questions on just the education and study behind it. But I'm curious for you personally, where do we need to go? What sort of things need to be introduced to the global workforce environment, future of work conversation that you think would actually be beneficial for humanity?
Yeah, I think we need to have a real honest conversation about universal basic income. I think we need to have a real honest conversation about social safety nets. A lot of this is all intersectional with notions of like, what's late stage capitalism going to look like in the future? What is capitalism plus? I haven't read deeply on this, but I've seen some chatter online around, there's going to be some sort of kind of, you take a Chinese capitalism and you marry it with an American capitalism, and that's going to be kind of the future where you have a much, as Americans, we would probably understand it as a capitalism that has a lot more top-down government type of intervention and engagement, while at the same time privatizing. There's going to be a private government sector, so to speak, in addition to the private and the public. So this a new sector will emerge, and you're going to see things like universal basic income is going to have to be a precondition for a lot of these ideas to actually work, given our economic structures. So I think those are the kinds of things that we have to begin leaning into. I think the other big thing is data ownership. I think for technologists and investors, really leaning into an understanding of how technologies like blockchain and cryptocurrency and again, this isn't my strong point here, technologically speaking, but these things are all going to have a role in how we establish value exchange moving forward. And I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to invert the paradigm of data ownership, where we allow people to form data unions. And we're already starting to see this, and there's some new emerging companies that are beginning to become these kinds of platforms. But if we allow users themselves to own their data and to create data unions, and organizations need to pay them to use their data in some way, if at the end of the year we get a check from Facebook or Instagram as our basically for our data subsidy or not our subsidy but rather our dividend, right? Our data dividend. That's going to change the dynamic, and it's going to change the way that we think about technology companies, and it's going to change the way that we think about how we relate to each other, and how we relate to the world around us, and how we use the tools that we use. I also think what it's going to do is it's going to introduce a new prerogative to a latent and untapped group of people who are complacent. So today, we don't really have a lot of say around how our data is used. And so there's that perpetuates a complacency. But I think if we had ownership of our data, what that would begin to do is you'd start to see these new innovation markets pop up, where these data unions would start to say, look, we own this data. We can do whatever we want with it. It is ours. And we're going to then solve our own problems instead of expecting someone else to do it for us, right? We're going to create our own social networks. We're going to create our own money exchange markets. We're going to create whatever it is, because we have the prerogative, and we're only, we're going to benefit from it. And so I think if you bring data ownership back to the users, again, thinkers like Jaron Lanier, who's the father of virtual reality and lives in Berkeley and teaches occasionally at UC Berkeley. He wrote a book called "Who Owns the Future?" That's probably the number one book that people need to read right now. Shoshana Zuboff's work has had a lot of traction in this, and her term of surveillance capitalism, right? So I think there's a growing movement where, for the GitHubs of the world are going to become private data unions, and when the ownership of data belongs to a user group, I think that's going to unleash a lot of innovation, and I think it's also going to make things like universal basic income more feasible at scale, based on the economic intersections with all of that. Anyways, that's really murky, and there's a lot of complicated nuance in there. So it's not something that's super easy to tease out. I think to simply answer your question, we need to be willing to evolve our notions of what it means to live in a modern, liberal society. And I know there's a lot of libertarians out there that have a lot of strong convictions, and I would say, like, bring those to the table. We need to keep hashing this stuff out, but get involved in these forums online, engage in the conversation, and do your homework. There's a lot of great literature out there that's been published on all of this, and what we need to do to essentially ensure that we're able to cross the threshold into the next stage of human evolution and social evolution in a way that's viable, resilient, and equitable, right? So, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it sounds like step one is do what we can as a society to give people more time.
Yes.
And if we give people more time, it allows sort of this innate human creativity to flourish, which can lead to all kinds of adjacent possibilities,
Yes.
opportunities that are gonna allow this spark of innovation to happen. I like that. I think that's good.
It's a good summary. Thanks for summarizing for me.
So I know you and I think about innovation a lot, and we have tons of ideas. And what I do professionally, one part of my group is a venture studio where we're constantly experimenting, tinkering, and experimenting with different ideas. But at the heart of innovation in particular, I know this intersects with work, intersects with design. But at the heart of innovation, what have you seen in your studies and in your work experience? What have you seen not work? And what have you seen that is actually pretty promising, that it actually could be signs of helping to architect innovation systems that would be beneficial for humanity?
Yeah, I think, the number one thing is productive inefficiency. So that's how we've been talking about it with our clients. Productive inefficiency, again, is just non-objective time, right? It's time spent without any sort of intentional utilitarian objective. It just is. Creating space and permission for that is the most singular, powerful thing that you can do to unleash new ideas. And that's, it's a bit ironic, and we often think it's like, oh, well, if we just have this process or this system or whatever, we can get to more ideas. And again, that's all leveraging Tayloristic industrial notions of efficiency and optimization. But innovation doesn't follow those rules. Those heuristics don't work for innovation. You can't optimize creativity. And so you have to think about it in unconventional ways. I think productive inefficiency is right. It's intentional, non-intentional time, right? It's just sitting with your thoughts. It's practicing presence. It's allowing all of the latent things to come into your mind. And this is really difficult for a lot of people who are addicted to the dopamine of apps, right? And that kind of release with every click and every like and every scroll. It's hard to just sit and not look at something. But that's what we need to practice more. So that's number one. Number two is we've conducted 2 studies on this in the last couple of years. And basically the big idea is, if you are in a leadership role within an organization, the number one way to cultivate a sense of safety, psychological safety specifically, which is a precondition for ideation and creativity, is to be accessible and responsive to those who are in distress. So this is all taken directly out of attachment theory. And we basically overlaid attachment theory, worked with organizational psychologists and others to understand how attachment theory shows up through these structures of hierarchy and leadership and systems of power in a workplace. And what we learned through this study was that the teams that generated the most ideas had the most amount of psychological safety, right? They felt comfortable saying stupid stuff. And those teams had leaders who were accessible and responsive to times of distress. So if I'm on your team and I'm like, God, like, Will, I'm having a really hard time with my kids, and like COVID stressed me out, and I'm really lonely because I haven't seen my friends, and I can't do Thanksgiving with my family, and I'm just carrying this like mental weight and this load. If you are, one, accessible to me, if I'm on your team, and I'm allowed to bring that to you, and you don't shame me for it, and two, you respond by saying, hey, take some time, or don't worry about this deliverable, let's push it to next week, or right, you take action in responding to that. What that tells me is you're a safe place. But not only are you a safe place, you're a foundation for me to stand on. And I can go then, so think about it this way. I don't know if you remember when your kids were small and you'd go to the park and you'd sit on the bench and they'd run around, right? They go run around the park. And every once in a while, running around the park, they look back at you like, is dad still sitting there? Okay, he's still there. I can keep running. I can keep exploring. And every once in a while, they'll come back and they're like, they just run up to you. They might not even say something. They put their hand on your knee, whatever, smile, and then run off again, right? That's all attachment theory, right? That's anchoring. That's, are you still here? Is my anchor still here? Is it still safe to explore and to play? That's what we're doing in the workplace as leaders, is we're basically saying, I'm still here. I'm still watching. Go play, right? So if your accessibility and your responsiveness to me is basically doing that, that's going to incentivize me to go pursue new ideas, to take risks, to present new ideas to the team, and to innovate. So those are the 2 things: productive inefficiency, creating non-objective time and space, and being an accessible and responsive leader and cultivating psychological safety. If you can do that, that would radically transform the culture of your team, and it will radically elevate in exponential ways the outcome of your ideas, or the quality and quantity of your ideas.
So that perfectly tees up sort of the last question I'd like to explore for today. And you mentioned this earlier about how designing the future of work can create a more equitable society where we might be able to be even combat our biases and prejudices. So from a DE&I perspective, how do you see kind of the big social experiment that we're going through today and this year, and where do you see us heading? Like, what opportunities do we have before us now on the DE&I subjects? I'm curious to kind of explore that to close us out today.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not a DE&I expert, and I haven't spent a lot of time in this space. One of the things, two things immediately that come up for me that I've been thinking about, and our team has been discussing. One is uh, the role of grief in our lives, and again, this is a creating space thing.
Hmm.
I think that one of the reasons bias training doesn't work is because it doesn't it frames the conversation in the tense of optimism. We can do this, we're going to get through it, we're going to change, right? We can get better. All we need to do is just acknowledge our biases, and we'll be a more inclusive, diverse organization or whatever. Bias training has been a massive failure for the last 20 years. It has not really moved the needle in any meaningful way. And so what we're exploring right now is, well, why is that? And our hunch, this is just a hunch, hasn't been proven yet, is that we don't know how to practice grief. And grief and the practice of grief is fundamental to empathy. And specifically as cisgendered straight white males who are in positions of power and influence, our inability to empathize is a pretty massive canyon that has to be bridged. And empathy isn't just necessarily like, I can see the world from your perspective. I think empathy is feeling what the person you're empathizing with is feeling. And I think grief, the weight of that, there is something that is so intrinsic and profound in grief that I think we, as a culture that shies away from loss and death and bad feelings in general, that we've really missed out on. And so I would say the opportunity, and this goes back to, maybe this is your point about connecting the dots here, being an accessible and responsive leader, acknowledging the difficulty of what it means to be a human today is so important, right? And acknowledging chronic stress, acknowledging fatigue and burnout. The World Health Organization just last year identified burnout as a workplace phenomenon that's diagnosable. Acknowledging the emotional stress and weight of not being able to be surrounded by your community and be in person with other folks that mean something to you. The stress and weight of our politics today. We have more access today via online news and other sources to the amount of suffering in the world, right? That's happening on a daily basis. It's unprecedented. So we're constantly carrying this stuff. And what embodiment science and other science is basically telling us is that we carry this stress. And it's a chronic stress. And I think that it's even generational. Trauma can be intergenerational and passed from one generation to another. So I think what we need in the DE&I world today, especially for leaders, is to identify, one, where we can create space, two, not shy away from negative feelings, and three, affirm and allow people to feel grief and to grieve all that's happening in the world. And not try and overspin it with optimism and hope, and that we're going to come out the other side and be stronger than ever. Like, just shut up for a minute and just allow it to hurt and be okay with the discomfort. It takes a strong leader to be able to do that, and you have to have courage. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to stand in the midst of discomfort with other people and to stand in their suffering with them, but that's what we need more of. And I think that's the opportunity right now for DE&I, is to stand in solidarity with the suffering of marginalized communities whose voices are being heard now for the first time in a lot of ways. And not tell them that it's going to be okay and we're going to hire a diversity consultant and we're going to do bias training and we're going to do all this stuff. Like, okay, fine. But also, will you just stand with them? Like, will you just be with them in the pain and the suffering and the turmoil of their history and of their existence?
Hmm.
and be okay with that? Can you allow people to cry at their desks, right? Like just those little things that aren't so little, but they are in some ways, will make, I think, a big impact on the way that we practice diversity, inclusion, and equity within our organizations, and then how that ripples out to our society at large.
It's a good word. I think that's a good place to stop for now for part one. I will look forward to a continued conversation around a lot of the themes and topics that we brought up today. Where can people find you online to continue the conversation?
JoelFariss.com, FARISS.com is my personal website. Gensler.com. I'm not really on there, but there's a contact form if you wanted to have a conversation on my website. I'm also on Instagram, Joel.Fariss, Twitter, same. So happy to engage. We'd love to continue the conversation with anyone who wants to.
Amazing. Thank you, Joel. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Appreciate it. It was fun.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups, and health science, and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it'd be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.